What is up, y'all? Welcome back to another Fish the Moment live stream. We're a couple minutes late tonight. Apologize there. It was just a lot of things to get prepared for today's live stream. We're going to be talking about fall bass migration, and I wanted to make sure I had all my graphics ready and in store so that we can make this live stream as information packed as possible. So excited to break out all the graphics, all the info, and really break down how bass migrate in the fall. I'm going to be covering the offshore scenarios and kind of how it applies offshore, and then Randy will be talking about how to follow the bass up shallow during this fall migration. Randy, how's it going tonight?
Doing good, Johnny. Just man, I tell you what, it's the last 3 or 4 days I have noticed it starting to cool off a little bit more in the evening.
Yep.
And I do not like that. I am not ready for cold weather. I want to stay in my shorts and my t-shirts for another 3 or 4 months, but it's on the way. It's coming, and I'm not really looking forward to it too much.
Man, I went camping over Labor Day weekend, and we were all prepared. It was nice. It was like 90-degree weather, and we were in shorts and t-shirts. We went to bed, woke up next morning. It was 58 degrees outside, and we were freezing. So we were not prepared for that cold weather, but that cold weather does mean that those bass are going to start their fall migration right now. Like, it's happening. It probably started happening a couple weeks ago, even as you got those first semi-cold nights. So We are right in the middle of that fall transition, and it's going to be going on for the next month or so. So this is the perfect live stream for you guys to be watching to make sure you don't miss that transition.
Yeah, it's a slow process. You know, one of the things that we'll talk about that in the podcast tonight, but there's like little windows where this transition accelerates from time to time, and a lot of it is weather based. A lot of it has to do with the daylight hours. It's a combination of a lot of factors, but we'll get into that in detail too.
For sure. We'll kind of break it all down, guys, show you as much as we can. And I'm actually going to be making a full-on video on the main Fish the Moment channel that's going to go into even more detail on the exact scientific reasons why the bass migrate into the creeks and have more refined graphics. So if you guys don't want to watch an hour-long live stream, or maybe you just kind of want something that summarizes it into like a 15-minute video, that video will be coming out not this week but next week, and so definitely stay tuned on the main Fish Moment channel for that. But before we get into anything, Randy, a couple things I want to do. First, I want to call out a brand new podcast sponsor. We are finally hitting it big time. Podcast 104. We now have 2 sponsors for the podcast. You guys are probably familiar with them. The Bass Tank in Oklahoma. My boat is wrapped with the Bass Tank, and they've stepped up to sponsor the podcast. So big shout out to Bass Tank. They are the premier bass fishing electronics installation guys in the country. If you guys need electronics in your boat, a lot of guys will drag their boats from across the country, even up in New York, over to Oklahoma to the Bass Tank to have them get their boats rigged up. They do it the right way. You guys know I use electronics in all my videos, and I'm a big electronics guy, and I don't trust anyone else to install my graphs other than the Bass Tank. I've had a lot of botched electronics installations over the years, Randy, and it's really annoying when you get your graphs installed, you go out to the lake, you go to use them, and it's not working properly. And for a lot of guys, they don't even know if it's working properly or not because they just assume it was installed properly. That's really a big miss, because if you then go graph for 5-6 hours and you don't have any idea if it's set up properly or not, you're wasting a bunch of time. So save yourself the hassle, go get it installed by the experts. That's what the Bass Tank does. So big shout out to the Bass Tank for sponsoring the podcast.
Yeah, you can definitely tell that too. When electronics, it doesn't matter if you're using 2D, side imaging, down imaging, whatever. If you don't, you can tell a huge difference if it's been professionally installed versus just some dude down at a boat dealership that doesn't really know what they're doing just slapped it on there. I mean, what you can see on your unit, the sensitivity of it, the visual is it's like night and day.
For sure. And then obviously we still have our other podcast sponsor, Bridgeford, with the beef jerky coming in clutch. We'll talk more about Bridgeford and Bass Tank as well later on into the stream. Normally we don't talk this much about sponsors at the beginning, but new sponsors, so I had to call it out. But I do want to announce the winner of last week's Bridgeford beef jerky giveaway. You get a free case of Bridgeford beef jerky every week. We give away a free case of 12 packs of beef jerky. So last week's winner was Mr. Cha, Mr. CHA. So if you left a comment, Mr. Cha, email us over at info@fishthemoment.com, and we'll send you a free case of Bridgeford beef jerky. And the comment last week that we asked you guys to leave from the last live stream was, what do you do on the lake to guarantee that you're going to catch a fish, or try your best to catch a fish every single time you go to the lake? And Mr. Cha said, the secret has been going with a strong mindset and discipline. If you believe it can be achieved, even with all the odds against you, mental focus and the ability to keep your own morale up can do wonders. I thought that was a great comment. A lot of times fishing is a very mental sport because you have to believe that there's fish down there that you're casting at, even if you're not getting bit. You have to believe that the next spot you go to is going to have fish, and that helps out so much when I'm on the water. And honestly, I don't catch fish within the first 4 hours of my fishing day, like 75% of the time. You know this, Randy. I catch most of my fish in the last 2 hours of every fishing day because it takes me a while to figure it out. And if you keep that mental attitude strong, going with the discipline, and just keep going, keep experimenting, and use process of elimination, you're going to be a lot more successful on the lake.
Yeah, that's a conversation I like to get in with people like on the beach drinking margaritas, because it gets way out there when you start talking about some of the mysterious variables in fishing that definitely play an element. If you guys don't believe me, talk to Rick Clunn, talk to any top bass pro out there. There's some intangible elements in the sport that on the mental side that really play a huge role in success on any level.
Yeah, for sure. And we love talking about that stuff, guys. We'll get into more of that stuff on the live stream. We love talking about it. I know some of you guys like hearing about it. Some guys are like, I'm going to go to sleep during that. Let's talk about baits. But we like to go a little bit more on the intellectual side over here, not just selling baits. That's kind of how we like to do it. And that's what we're going to talk about today, guys. We're going to get down to a little bit of the science of the fall migration, how it all works, everything like that. Oh, by the way, we will be doing our Bridgeford Beef Jerky giveaway today. We'll let you guys know halfway through the stream how you can sign up for that. So just stick around halfway through the stream, and you'll be able to enter in to win a free case of Bridgeford Beef Jerky. Again, huge shout out to them for sponsoring the podcast. Good deal. Okay, so Randy, I'm going to kind of lay it out for guys real quick, just the general overview of the fall bass migration. And this is going to be very high level, just to kind of get us all started. And then I'm going to pass it over to you to talk about how you kind of focus on the fall migration up shallow, and then I'll talk about how I approach it offshore. But just to kind of jump into it really quick, I'm just going to share a couple things on the screen that are hopefully going to help drive home my point on how the fall bass migration works. So just give me half a second. I got graphics and slides and all kinds of crazy stuff here. So let me just kind of get some stuff pulled up, make sure we got everything going on. Let me find it.
I don't know if everybody out there appreciates the level of preparation it takes to put one of these live podcasts on. I could never do it. I mean, it's like a physics equation to me. So you guys out there are like me that are sort of, technically challenged a little bit. We're pretty fortunate to have Jonny be able to navigate. You know how fast he goes through the screens? He just likes all over the place like it's nothing. I'm impressed.
Well, most guys on the live stream, they have their own crew that have like 2 people running the live stream for them. It's just me. I'm just hanging out. That's pretty much it. I'm just, doing my own thing, running 2 desktop screens, like 25 browsers. I'm back and forth. I gotta make sure I transition so I don't leave the other screen. It's a whole nightmare, but it helps having you here. When I do it by myself, Randy, I always screw something up. So it's nice to have you here. Kind of like you can fill the time when I'm screwing around with the screens. But anyways,
it's much easier. I mean, it's much easier to talk about it like in the sense that it's harder than what it looks. Is what I'm trying to say. I mean, all this stuff to make this happen right here. I mean, it is. I mean, Jonny babysits me all the time on all the map breakdowns I do, anything that has to do with the computer. I mean, I had 1 year typing in high school back in 1976, so that's the extent of my technology.
For sure. Awesome. Well, let's show off some of that technology. So we have a little lake here, Lake DeGray in Arkansas. I'm going to kind of start by talking about fall bass migration, mainly on man-made lakes. That's where most of our viewers are going to be tuning in from. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about maybe some natural lakes just at the end for those guys. But basically, the idea behind this fall bass migration revolves around the bass moving from the main center part of the lake, the center area of the lake, back into the creek arms. That's the highest level idea behind what bass do in the fall. They move from the main part of the main lake is what we call it, back into all the various creek arms. I'll pull up a screen over here really quick, and I'll pull up Lake degree on Navionics. I know for some guys, you like to see it on Google Earth. Some people prefer to see it on Navionics. So I'll kind of roll both of them for you guys here just so you can kind of see. I like to give as many visuals as I can. It seems to help out. So here is Lake DeGray. Here's kind of your main lake. You can see this really deep water, this creek channel that's in like 120 foot of water. This is where a lot of the fish are going to relate during the summertime. More towards the main lake out here in the center. As the fall progresses, though, and we get these first few cold nights of the year, bass are going to start making their way back into the creeks. And a lot of guys are always wondering, why do bass move back into the creeks? How fast do they move back into the creeks? All these different factors. And I'm going to give you guys just a very quick idea of how this works with the rudimentary graphics here. Again, I'm going to have a full video on the main Fish of the Moment channel where I break it down with a lot better graphics, and I'll put like 20 hours into editing that video. So go check out the main Fish of the Moment channel. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. But basically, what you're dealing with is at any given time on most of these man-made lakes, you're going to have what's called the thermocline. Now, you may have heard the thermocline talked about before, and it's basically this area of the lake where, or this part of the water column where you have a mixture of waters. The water above your thermocline is going to have high oxygen, and it's going to be warmer water. The reason for this is because the water up above is getting touched by the air, and it's going to be heated up by the sun. Just like air, where warm air rises, the warm water is also going to rise. So this warmer water that's heated up by the sun and the warm temperatures, 90-degree heat during the middle of the summer, will keep this warmer water near the surface, and it's going to keep the oxygen content high in the top of the water column. However, as you get deeper and deeper, you'll find that the water is going to be further away from the surface where the oxygen is, and it's also going to be further away from the sun, which heats up the water. This means that the water at the bottom of the lake is going to be colder and have less oxygen. The reason it has less oxygen is because cold water will sink down to the bottom and the warm water will rise, and it will cause a stratification, or basically a divide between where you have this cold water and this warm water. This cold water sinks to the bottom, and it never really comes in contact with the air, which means that it's going to have very low oxygen levels. And bass and bait fish need oxygen to survive. So what you'll find is that the majority of the fish in your lake, especially your bait fish, are not going to want to go below the thermocline for most of the time. There are exceptions where the bass will go below the thermocline, and I can get into that in that other video. I'm not going to get into all the specifics. It's just too complicated without graphics and stuff to explain. I want to be able to show the bait fish moving and stuff. I'm just kind of a nerd like that. I like to make it as easy to understand as possible, but hopefully this is making sense. And basically what you'll find is that when the thermocline is set up, all of your fish are going to set up at or near the thermocline or above the thermocline. So they might be as shallow as a foot of water down to, let's say, 35 feet of water where the thermocline is here. The problem, though, is that as you get into the fall, the water temperature is going to start to drop because you have cold nights. Like I said at the beginning of the live stream, I was camping this past weekend, and I went to bed, and it was like 89 degrees outside. I woke up, and it was like 59 degrees outside. And then during the day, it was still 90 degrees again. But those cold nights drop the water temperature. You can actually see, like in the fall, there's a lot of fog on the water. What's happening is that those colder air temperatures are hitting that warmer water, and they're warming, or they're cooling it down. So whenever you get a lot of fog in the early or the late summer, early fall, it's because that surface temperature is cooling off. What happens then is because this surface temperature starts to cool off, this water starts to cool down and starts to sink a little bit deeper. And as that water starts to sink deeper, it starts to mix with the water at the bottom of the lake. And at some point, when the water gets cold enough, the water on top, above your thermocline here, is going to be colder than the water at the bottom of the lake. Therefore, because now the water at the bottom of the lake is warmer than the water at the top of the lake, this bottom of the lake water is going to rise and then mix, and all the water is going to mix together. Again, I'm going to make a video showing this with graphics and stuff. It's going to make a lot more sense. But basically, you're going to have the water mixing. And what will happen is that the water that has a lot of good oxygen is going to fall to the bottom of the lake. The water with very little oxygen is going to rise to the top of the lake. And you're going to have all kinds of random oxygen levels all around the lake. You're going to have high oxygen at the bottom of the lake and low oxygen at the top of the lake, and the fish are just going to get completely screwed up. They're not going to like that because there's all this weird mixing of oxygen levels. It's like almost like if you walked outside your front door and all of a sudden you were breathing, and then the next minute you couldn't breathe because there was no oxygen, and then you walked 20 more feet and you could breathe again. Like the water's mixing up and it's getting really weird, and those fish just don't like it. Now, one quick question is, with the rivers and stuff like that, do you have a thermocline? Usually no. When you have a lot of current flow through your lake, a thermocline usually doesn't set up that much, though it will slightly. But usually the thermocline doesn't set up as much on river systems. And that means that the bass don't really migrate as much as they normally do on lakes. And what'll happen, and I'll explain the migration on the lakes first, and I'll kind of translate to rivers. Again, the video I'm going to put on my channel will be a lot more coherent and well put together than this. This is just me kind of going off the fly. But basically what's happening is that your lake mixes, and as that water temperature, surface temperature drops, all of the water in the lake is going to mix together, and it's going to have weird pockets of good oxygen and bad oxygen all over the lake. Your thermocline has now disappeared, and those fish are going to be all screwed up because the water is all screwed up. As a result, what you're going to find is that a lot of bass are going to start migrating to areas where there was never a thermocline set up. What I mean by that is that out here on the main lake, let's say the thermocline was set up in 30 feet of water on this main lake. So way out here on the main lake in the summer, your thermocline is set up in 30 feet of water. Well, what happens is that because all of the water that has, high oxygen in it was 30 feet or less of water, this is where the fish were most comfortable. But now that the water is mixed and everything is screwed up, it's not really comfortable anywhere where the thermocline had set up in the past. As a result, what you'll find is that the bass are going to start making a move back into areas where the water is no deeper than 30 feet. Back in here, like let's say back in this cove where it's 21 foot of water, the thermocline probably never set up in the back of this pocket or the back of this cove. Thermocline never set up there, it's too shallow, and there's just one oxygen level throughout this entire bay, the back of this creek. Therefore, the water isn't mixing, and it's not this weird, uncomfortable range where the water is high oxygen, then low oxygen, then high oxygen, low oxygen. That might happen out here, where it's still 50 foot of water. There might still have been a thermocline here, but as you get further and further back in the creeks, there's no thermocline setting up back in here. As a result, those bass are going to make a beeline in the back of these creeks. More specifically, it's not really the bass, it's more the bait fish that make a beeline. And I'll explain that more in my other video. But as a result, these bass are going to start migrating back in these creeks because that thermocline is disappearing. Now, you'll find that the bass aren't just not going to immediately go from the main lake back in the back of the creeks within like a week. This thermocline dissipation is going to happen over the course of like a month and a half or 2 months. Really, it starts at like the end of August when you get those very first cooler nights. They're like in the 70s even or 60s. It doesn't need to be the super cold weather. And it continues all the way through until you get really cold surface temperatures and cold nights. And that will push those fish back in the creeks. Now, one of the questions we had is, well, what about on a river system? What happens there? Do you have this migration? Well, no, not necessarily. You're not necessarily going to have this migration on these river systems because that thermocline is not present. So if we go to like the Arkansas River here, the thermocline never sets up on this main river because the current is constantly flowing. As a result, those bait fish and the bass have no need to go back into the creeks and migrate way back in the back of the creeks to find areas where the thermocline never set up. The thermocline never set up anywhere. Therefore, I still catch a lot of fish on river systems like the Arkansas River on the main river throughout the entire fall. Those fish will never migrate back into the creek arms or the backwaters, the bayous. They'll stay on that main river. And there's a whole other thing about river migration for bass that I can talk about that's completely different. But basically, that is kind of the idea that you're dealing with. You have, on river systems, there's no thermoclines, so the bass kind of stay in the main river, or they can be everywhere. But on lakes, the bass are going to be moving back in the creeks. Now I see a couple guys saying 30 foot, that this lake is super deep and clear. What's going on? Well, really, the thermocline can set up in a lot of different ranges. It doesn't need to just set up in 30 foot. This is just an example. Sometimes the thermocline sets up in 10 foot of water. If your lake is only 30 foot maximum depth, maybe the thermocline set up in 8 to 10 foot of water, but the backs of the creeks are in like 2 foot of water. So then they migrate into the shallower creeks. But sometimes the lakes are super deep and the thermocline's in 45 foot of water. So this is all relative to different lakes. And again, I'll explain it more in the other video. It'll make more sense. I know there's a ton of questions that are getting flown around, and hopefully those will get cleared up later. But that's kind of the idea of why bass are migrating. And it's obviously not the most straightforward concept to discuss. So hopefully that made some sense. But the big picture, guys, to take away from all of that stuff I was just talking about is that bass are migrating back into the creeks because the thermocline is disappearing. The lake is turning over. That's what it's called. The lake turns over, and then they move from the main lake back in the backs of the pockets. That's the general gist of it overall. Any comments on that, Randy?
Yeah, I got a lot of comments on that, and I'm going to try not to confuse everybody completely here, because I can tell you all something right now, that fall fishing is all over the place. It can be extremely confusing. It can be extremely frustrating for a lot of different factors. The way that Jonny laid it out there, it's like, first of all, guys, you have to have a foundation to begin with somewhere. You can't just get out there and just really not have any type of a game plan. So what Jonny laid out there is a solid foundation for beginning your search. Given that, there's a ton of variables that will affect that alter that particular foundation.
Yep.
And in my opinion, the two main factors are water clarity and the species of fish in the lake. It's like when you have a mixed species lake, like largemouth, spotted bass, smallmouth, those fish react completely different. And from my experience, and I'll talk about the shallow water applications here. From my experience, you have a wide range of ways that you can catch them in the creeks and the main lake both. Now, if you go to a lake more that's predominantly largemouth, I found it to be very true what Jonny talks about, as far as you see this really defined migration of bass from the main lake into the creek arms on a lake that has a big largemouth population. But if you take a lake, and I'll use a lake like Cumberland or Cherokee Lake or Table Rock or Bull Shoals or even Lake Lanier a little bit, these lakes that are clear water lakes that have mixed species in there, a lot of times that fall migration that Jonny talks about, it happens, but it doesn't happen to the extent that it does on a straight largemouth lake. For example, let's take Lake Lanier in Georgia, for example. If you went down there right now, and even over the next month or so, you're going to have a ton of patterns that are possibly working. You're going to have the creek bite that Jonny talks about. There's going to be a shad migration. You're going to be able to go up to the upper creek extremities and a little bit more stained water and fish whatever available covers up there. It could be rock, wood, docks, whatever. And you're going to catch some bass, and you're going to catch some bass over the course of the next month doing that. Most of those bass are going to be primarily largemouth in that particular area. But at the same time, you can have one of you guys could be up there throwing a squarebill crankbait way up the Chattahoochee River as far as you can go. And then you'll have somebody else down there, down by the dam, that's fishing a drop shot over the top of treetops in 90 foot of water, and these bass are suspended 30, 40 foot down over the treetops. Then you may have some guy at the same day, he's up throwing a whopper plopper on some flat points in the mid-lake area and catching them. Then you've got some guys that maybe are fishing breakwalls or seawalls and docks and catching them. So it can be extremely frustrating way as far as how to break this down. Now, the things that I'll tell you guys right off the bat that sort of gives me a clue to how I want to fish is the weather patterns and the sky conditions, the light intensity versus the water clarity you have. Now, I know this is getting up there on a little bit higher level, but if you have a lake that has water visibility of over, say, 4 foot, and you've got a mixed species of lake, in my opinion, as far as from a shallow water perspective, and Jonny can talk to the point of offshore because it's deep, it's different, I know. But from my perspective, on a shallow water fall transition, what happens is there is a segment of those bass that live on the main lake throughout the fall, and you don't know they're there unless you get the right set of weather circumstances. I'll say, for example, there could be a series of main lake points in the mid part of the lake, and you may fish them during a typical sunny day where it's 80 degrees and 10-mile-an-hour winds and not catch much. You go back there the next day and a front rolls in and it's misty rain and the wind's blowing 15 miles an hour. You can get up there with the Zara spook or burning a spinnerbait and just absolutely whack them on the same spot. These bass in clearwater lakes in the fall time of the year, they feed very heavily according to wind, weather, sky conditions on the main lake. They're very sensitive as far as the weather variables that come in. Now, if you concentrate on the skinny water, back of the coves, back of the creeks, that type of stuff, those bass are not near as affected by the weather patterns that come in. Those bass are resident fish. They're relating to targets. They set up on targets. They've got shad to feed on that are moving back in there, and they're a lot more predictable. But there's a segment of those bass, in my opinion, a fairly large population, that they may be out there suspended off the end of the point in the fall time in the year, not biting. They may be using different water columns, different depth zones. And when the conditions get right, they'll move up shallow and you can whack them on that. But, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the podcast, but I don't want to throw that out there to make it sound like, okay, now I don't know what to do. Do I need to be on the main lake, down the mid lake? Do I need to be up the river? From my experience, the advice I can give you guys in the fall time of the year when you're dealing with the transition is pay very close attention to the weather patterns leading up to the time you're fishing there, the weather patterns the day that you're fishing, water visibilities, water levels, and make a determination on how you want to fish. If you guys like to fish, top waters, you can do that. If you want to do shallow cranking, you can do that. Make up your mind how you want to try to approach that fish and then attack that part of the lake based upon the best information that you have. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But like I said, I think a lot of us out there, especially guys that are very old, you've heard Rick Clunn talk about this big migration of bass up into the creeks in the fall. That he's famous for that. He talks about throwing his little bitty crankbaits in the back of the creeks. He's done that for years. And that works. There's a segment of the bass that do that, but there's a lot of bass that break all the rules and they don't listen to that. So I hope that intro right there didn't confuse everybody too much.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Randy, because with the shallow fishing, that's why I gave up on shallow fishing in the fall. I used to suck at fall fishing because I would always try to fish shallow because that's what everyone told me I had to do. You have to go back in the creeks, throw a topwater, or throw a square bill on the main lake or whatever it was. And I never caught fall fish. I hated fall fishing. And I finally figured it out about 3 or 4 years ago, and I now love fall fishing. It's my favorite time of the year, but it's because I've tried to eliminate as much of that variability as possible. And let me explain what I'm trying to talk about here. So what Randy just mentioned is that basically there's a potential with that thermocline changing and all that stuff that the bass could be out here on the main lake out here. They could potentially be way back in the back of these creeks. They can be all over the place. And it's very true. And there's bass at the beginning of the fall or late summer that are already back in the back of the creeks to begin with. There's also bass that are going to stay out on the main lake the entire year. What my rule of thumb, though, is I try to stay with the majority of the bass. And what I mean by that is that the bass are going to be making a beeline, or at least some of the bass are making a beeline into the back of this creek back in here. So that's just kind of I just drew a line right there of that's where the bass migration route is, from the main lake back into here. There are currently bass in the back of the creek right now in September, and there's currently bass out here on the main lake. But what I would say is right now in first week of September, the majority of the bass are probably going to be near the main lake to the first third of this creek, somewhere in this zone. And what I'm going to try to do is stay with where I feel like the majority of the bass are going to be. Now, how do you know where they're going to be? It's usually where the majority of the forage is going to be, the bait fish. And as you progress further into the fall, let's say late September, early October, a lot of those bait fish are going to have migrated further back in the creeks because that thermocline is disappearing. Now, does that mean that there's not going to be fish out here in the main lake? No. There are fish on the main lake. There are also going to be fish here, and there are going to be fish in the backs of the creeks. But what I would say is that maybe 20% of your bass, 30% of your bass might be on the main lake. 50% of your bass are going to be in this middle of the creek, and then another 20 to 30% are going to be in the back of the creek. Now, I'm trying to put myself in a position where I'm around 50% of the bass. The way I do this is I use my electronics. I will graph a lot to find the bait fish. And there are times, depending on the water clarity, where I will find fish in the middle of these creeks up in 3 or 4 foot of water on like a shallow flat. And then sometimes they're out here in the middle of the creek channel in 60 foot of water. The bait fish in the fall, they can be in a lot of different depths because when that thermocline disappears, there's nothing really capping out how deep they're going to go other than the water clarity itself. And I'll make another video explaining how deep bass go based on water visibility. But in general, if you have like clear water, you can catch fish. If you have like 5 foot of water visibility, you can catch fish in the fall out of 70 or 80 feet of water. Now, if you get really dirty in your dirty lakes, bass usually don't set up that deep. They might only be 15 feet deep at the max in 2 foot of water visibility, and that's a whole other topic to discuss. But basically, the idea is that these bass are going to be migrating into these creeks, and I know that if I can find the area where I'm seeing the most shad presence, usually I'm going to be in good shape. Now, there's even more nuance to that in the sense that I actually like to stay just a tiny bit ahead of the shad, because what I find is that those bass, they actually like to stay just a little bit ahead of the shad. They'll get to the next stop, like let's say they'll get to this section of the creek maybe like a week before the shad get there. And I don't know how they know what it is, but for me, I always try to stay a little bit ahead of the fish rather than being behind them. If I'm behind the fish fishing in the main lake when they're already back in here, that's too late. I try to stay just a tiny bit ahead of the fish. It just seems to get bigger fish in the boat for me. And this is the same on spotted bass, smallmouth, or largemouth for me. They will all migrate like this. Now again, sometimes you're going to find smallmouth that just live out here on the main lake. But when I'm talking offshore fishing, usually about 50% of your bass are going to follow those shad around from in and out of these creeks year round. There's like just a group of fish, a class of fish, 50% of the fish in my estimations, that just move through these creeks. And then there's about 10 to 15% of the bass that will stay in the back of the creeks, middle of the creeks, and the main lake, if we're talking man-made lakes. So the idea behind this is that I want to try to find that section where the majority of the bait fish are and the majority of those bass are. Now, when I'm fishing for these fish, specifically offshore, I'm basically trying to find the bait fish and then try to mimic baits that are going to really get me to imitate that bait fish, be around that the bass are feeding on. So really, I have like 4 baits I throw in the fall, and that's it. I've kind of narrowed it down. Kind of like in the winter, I throw like 4 categories of baits. In the fall, I throw like 4 baits offshore. That's it. I don't get very fancy. The key baits I go to, number 1 is some type of deep diving or medium diving crankbait. So Striking 6XD if the fish are in that like 15 to 20 foot range. Megabass Deep X 300 if they're in that like 10 to 12 foot range. And I even go, if they're in like the 8 foot range, I use the Megabass Deep X 200. And then if they're kind of shallower than that, I'll go to like a Strike King Series 3. And I'll have all 4 of these crankbaits in the deck of the boat in the fall because I just don't know on a given day if the fish are going to be in 20 foot of water or in 2 foot of water. So I kind of carry all these crankbaits in the deck of the boat and just have those tied on all fall. If the water is a little bit clear, maybe a little bit deeper, the fish get in like that 30 to 40 foot range, my other go-to baits are going to be a big flutter spoon. This is a Nichols Mini Magnum flutter spoon. I also throw a smaller slab spoon, like a little Jewel. I don't have any around with me, but a little Jewel scuba spoon, a 1 ounce jigging spoon. So I like spoons a lot in the fall. Or some type of swim bait, whether that's a 1 ounce jig head. This is Picasso 1 ounce jig head with a Megabass Spark Shad 5-inch. Or this is a little prototype head. Don't look at that. Oh, this way. Don't. That's a prototype head I cut off my rod that we're coming out with for Jewel. But that's a little 5/8 ounce jig head on a 4-inch Megabass Spark Shad. But that's a really good deal when it's a little bit clear. And then if I get really sunny, just nothing day, football jig. What I've been told, and this is what I learned a long time ago, guys, is that football season is when you need to throw a football jig. The best bait in football season is a football jig. And football season lasts from basically this next weekend, September, all the way through to January, February. That's when football jigs are at their absolute best. Football season. This is the Fish Moment Offshore jig. It's my football jig I designed for Jewel Bait Company. You're going to see this in a lot of videos coming forward, and I have a strike or a Jewel Bait Versacraw, that little trailer I designed for my football jig. So a Versacraw Junior on the back of a football jig. If it's sunny and those fish are kind of in inactive mode, I basically just throw a football jig as my go-to offshore bait. And then if they're more aggressive, I throw a swim bait, a spoon, or a deep diving crankbait. And I don't get much fancier than that. Those are the baits I throw. That's all I throw practically all fall. And I'm just trying to find that section of the lake that those bass are feeding in and really just keying in on that. If you can find it, you're absolutely going to hammer them, guys, and it's not that hard to catch them. But if you're in the wrong section of that creek offshore, it's going to be very, very difficult to get a consistent bite going. That's what I always struggled with in the falls. I was always trying to just fish everything, fish all over the place. And I didn't think about these creeks in sections, back of the creek, middle of the creek, front of the creek, or main lake. I would just fish everything, and I sucked at fall fishing. I finally kind of dialed it in to finding the bait fish, or figure out which section of these creeks had the most bait fish, then just graph a lot to find out what depth they're in, and then boom, you catch them. There's obviously a lot more nuance to it as well, Randy. There's so much I could get into, but that's kind of a general idea. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a complex topic. I mean, if you feel like you're intimidated a little bit by what we're talking about, don't feel bad, because I'm telling you guys, fall is one of the most difficult times to fish. And I'll use another example, because a lot of this stuff, what Jonny and I were talking about, we're talking about typical man-made impoundments with some variations. But if you take a body of water, some of the famous body waters like Toledo Bend, Sam Rayburn, the TVA lakes, that type of stuff, those lakes right there don't fall into the same category sometimes. A lot of times those bass will not use the creeks on lakes that have a lot of vegetation as much. They go to where the vegetation is at. The only thing that changes in the transition from the summer to fall to spring is the techniques that you use. For example, say if you're fishing at Sam Rayburn Lake right now, and if you were down there in February, you'd have these hydrilla flats on the main lake that maybe were 2 to 3 feet off the bottom, and they're over 8 or 9 feet. And if you're down there right now, you've got the same hydrilla flats that are matted out over the surface. So in March, you may be catching them on a chatterbait or a lipless crankbait, and this time of year, those fish are in the same spot, but you're catching them flipping a 1 ounce jig in the mat. So that'll throw a wrench a little bit on, as far as what is the typical fall movements of bass. So that's one of the things you have to look at. Another thing is on your man-made lakes, you got to really pay close attention to the rivers that feed the lake, as far as how these fish are going to react a little bit. For example, if you take like a Lake Eufaula in Alabama. Lake Eufaula in Alabama, it has a lot of dead water on the main lake. It's good on the main lake. There's some areas, especially on the lower end down there, that produce a lot of winning strings of fish. But overall, you have a tremendous amount of dead water in the lake, and you have a real predictable transition in the fall of those bass moving into the creeks, like Jonny was talking about. The creeks have better cover in them. They've got a lot of shallow grass. They've got docks. They've got laydowns. They've got water willows. So a lot of it on this transition, as far as the numbers of bass that will move into these typical areas, has to do with the available cover that's there. Because bass have got to have some type of a cover, especially the good fish. I'll use an example at Table Rock Lake. I was down there last week fishing the back of this one major creek. There were shad everywhere back there. It was sort of flattened out in the back. Water visibility was like a, 1.5 feet, close to 2 feet. Perfect. Big shad schools over, typical fall transition of shad to the back of the creek. But there wasn't much cover. There was occasionally you'd have some isolated wood here and there. And we caught a bunch of fish, but they were all little ones. There wasn't any good fish back there. So when you're talking about following these bass back into the creeks and the coves and the shallows in the fall transition, you've got to have an area that has a sustainable amount of cover to hold those quality fish. It can be anything. Like I said, it can be docks, it can be wood, it can be rock transitions, but there has to be something there. I mean, bass, a good fish, when you're talking about the 3 pound plus fish, those fish have got to have the prime piece of cover. They're in shallow water. They're setting them up on ambush points unless the weather is really nasty where they're roaming. Same when Johnny fishes out deep. I mean, all the good fish he catches are usually going to be around some type of hard structure, break, brush, that type of stuff. That's just what they do. So I think one of the things you have to do when you're trying to make sense out of this whole fall transition is everybody out there has the lake that they fish. I mean, I don't think we have a lot of like touring pros on the podcast here. So you guys have the lake that you fish, or lakes that you fish around your house. The first thing that you probably want to do is take stock of the characteristic of that lake, like I was talking about. Determine, figure out what the water clarities are all around the lake. Figure out what the cover is, the species of fish, and then once you have that determination, that can give you a good idea of how those bass are going to move and migrate in the fall time of the year. Let me give you guys a prime example of Table Rock Lake. If there's a tournament at Table Rock Lake in September or October, like every September and October, there is always, out of the top 10 in the tournament, there's always a handful of guys that are down on the lower end of the lake fishing drop shots with the live scopes over the deep timber for these super deep spotted bass, fishing really deep. That's going on. At the same time, there's going to be a couple guys that are fishing as far up the Kings River as they can get, throwing square bill crankbaits. Then there'll be some dude throwing a buzzbait or a whopper plopper in the mid-lake cove. So, there's a lot of stuff going on there, but I think that what Johnny was talking about before, you do have a significant movement of bass into the creeks. One of the things that I've noticed myself in the fall transition myself is I like to fish secondary points in the creeks in the fall. And I notice that there's a transition that happens between like June, July, and August and into September. Once you start getting into September, those secondary creek points start holding more fish than like the main lake points do. And it was sort of, you could catch them either or during the summertime of the year, but as September, October gets, those secondary points start producing a little bit better. You start seeing more shad activity. You start seeing more balls of shad out off the point ends and sides. You just start seeing that slow progressive of more bass into that water. So again, I hope that wasn't too confusing, but I'm just trying to share what I've seen to my own experience.
For sure. And if that was a little bit confusing, I know guys are like, I'm more confused than when we started. I'm going to give you guys a very specific example here of exactly how this fall transition works using this creek. I was over here. This is Jordan Lake over in North Carolina. I'd never fished this lake before in my life before I got here. It was in September a couple of years ago, and it was an actual fall transition. And I was there for 2 weeks. Normally I'm not fishing the same lake day after day after day for 2 weeks, but I was over there doing on-the-water fishing lessons and stuff like that. And I was tracking the fish through this creek. And I want to explain exactly how I found fish in this creek. I caught them in a different spot every single day we came there, and I'm going to explain why they moved all this stuff. Before I do that, though, got to pay the bills, so just stay tuned because it's going to be a really, really good demonstration of how this works. I think it'll clear up a lot of confusions. But first things first, a couple things I want to call out. First thing is that I wanted to give a huge shout out to our new podcast sponsor, the Bass Tank. Bass Tank is now sponsoring the podcast. We were up to 2 official sponsors, 104 podcasts in finally, getting some sponsors. So huge shout out to the Bass Tank. They were at my boat, and they're the premier electronics installation company in the country, guys. Basically, you can go over to thebasstank.com, give them a call, let them know what you're looking for in your boat. They're not going to steer you wrong. The one thing I see a lot of guys mess up on when they go get graphs and stuff is that they go to Bass Pro Shops or wherever, not to share on Bass Pro Shops, but they go somewhere like that. The guy there has never actually used a fish finder to go catch bass before in like a serious way. They recommend these different graphs that they think you need. It's not actually what you need because the guys aren't fishermen. They don't go fish for bass consistently, and you just don't get the right service. Well, the owner of the Bass Tank, John Sukup, he is an amazing angler. He's won 2 of the National Professional Fishing League tournaments this year out of the 4 events they've had. He's an absolute stick. All the guys there at the Bass Tank are fishermen. They've won local tournaments. They fish in all the local derbies. They know what they're doing, and they know how to install the graphs, and they also know how to recommend the right graphs for you. That's the key. What graphs do you need for your fishing? So definitely check out the Bass Tank. They're over in Oklahoma. Just give them a call here by going to basstank.com and checking out their number, or just shoot them an email, and they will definitely set you up right. Another thing to call out real quick while I'm on the screen is a couple of things on fishthemoment.com. If you guys are interested in more in-depth instruction that is a little bit more prepared, where we actually, have a full setup presentation and everything like that, and you want to actually meet us in person, we're going to be doing a bass camp coming up here in October. That's right, bass camps are back. I haven't done one in like 2 years. This is an in-person camp with Randy and myself, and Randy's going to be giving you a solid overview foundation of how to think like a shallow water angler and be successful. And then I'm going to be giving you my information and foundations on offshore bass fishing. You're actually going to be able to meet with both of us in the exact same day, and we're going to prepare a curriculum for you guys that kind of shadows or mirrors each other. Where basically Randy's going to be talking about all the concepts, shallow water fishing, and then when you talk with me, you're going to be able to hear everything from an offshore perspective and compare and contrast our styles, see what works best for you, and also meet us in person. This bass camp is going to be taking place on October 2nd, Saturday, October 2nd, in Springfield, Missouri at the Boatworks shop. So shoot out to the Boatworks. They sponsor Randy, and they're going to let us actually do the seminar in their shop. We'll actually have a bait shop over there. We're going to be able to go through all the baits and stuff we throw, and you can actually click here to learn more on the website with a detailed itinerary of exactly what you can expect from the bass camp, all these different things. You get 4 hours of instruction with me, 4 hours of instruction with Randy. Very limited class. We're going to basically have 30 potential places, 30 spots available. That's it. You get 15 people in each session with me and Randy, so it's a small group setting. Don't want to get too many people in there because it'll get crowded. And this course is going to be $500. So might be a little bit steep for some guys, but I guarantee you it's going to be worth it. We're going to prepare a ton for this curriculum for you guys and for the itinerary, so you're definitely going to come out a better angler for sure. So definitely check out this bass camp coming up October 2nd over in Springfield, Missouri. Other thing, too, real quick, I want to let you guys know that we do have more lake breakdowns coming to the website over here at fishthemoment.com. If you guys want some help finding offshore and shallow spots in the fall, you can actually check out our fall lake breakdowns that we do here on the website. Randy has a bunch of shallow water lake breakdowns, and I have a lot more coming to the website for offshore lake breakdowns, where you get 40 GPS waypoints you can put straight in your fish finder on lakes all across the country. We also have our personalized lake breakdowns, where if we don't have your lake, Randy will break those down for you, and you can check those out. We still have a few available today, and we restock every single Monday and Tuesday, so definitely check those out. Okay. We're going to get into my example here, but one last thing, and you guys aren't going to want to miss this. Sorry, we have so many things now. We got sponsors. I have to talk. I feel like I'm talking for hours. I don't feel that bad, though, because like most podcasts, Randy, they have like 4-minute blocks of commercials, so I don't feel too bad. But I appreciate everyone sticking around. I see the count isn't going down, so thanks for kind of, we've tried to give out a lot of free information, but this really does help support the content, so really appreciate it. But one last thing is we want to let you guys know how you can enter in for a Bridgeford beef jerky giveaway. This last week, Mr. Cha, he won the giveaway, so email us over at info@fishthemoment.com, send us your mailing address, and we'll get Bridgeford to ship you 12 packs of Bridgeford beef jerky. What I want you guys to do, though, is I want you in the comments to leave your number one question about the fall migration. What is the most confusing element of this fall bass migration to you guys? I'm going to be making a full YouTube video on my YouTube channel with detailed graphics and everything like that over on the main Fish the Moment YouTube channel. And if you've subscribed over here to Fish the Moment Live and don't know about the Fish the Moment channel, go subscribe there. It's where I actually have my edited 20-minute highly educational videos with a ton of graphics. I spend 20 hours editing. And so definitely check out that channel, but leave your comment down below in the description of what your number one question is about fall migration bass fishing. I will then include those, as many as I can, and answer as many as I can in the upcoming video, and you'll have a chance to win a free case of Bridgeford beef jerky on next week's live stream. So tune in next week to see if you won, and that is that. Okay, Randy, anything I missed? Anything you want to add on any of that? There was a lot of talking.
Yeah, I am really excited about the bass camp. And another thing about you guys that's never been to Springfield, this is where the the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame is here in Springfield at the Wonders Wildlife Aquarium, which is right next to the Bass Pro Shop National Headquarters. So it'd just be a great weekend if you guys want to come hang out with us over that weekend and check out Bass Pro Hall of Fame, Fishing Hall of Fame. It's really cool.
For sure. It's a really, really good trip. So definitely check that out, guys. Awesome. Okay. Well, let me run through this example, Randy, and I almost want to give you guys a better, more concrete example of how this fall migration works. Something that you can really latch your mind onto, and hopefully it'll be a little bit less confusing. So, again, got Jordan Lake here in North Carolina. And the whole thing about this lake, guys, is it's a pretty typical lake. It has like 2 to 3 foot of water visibility, has some creek arms, pretty much a standard lake. And I'm going to give you an example of this, and if you guys are still confused, I can give you an example of a river too. But just to start out here with this lake, to give you an idea of how this migration works. Basically, when I got to this lake, I had no idea where the fish were. I'd never fished it before in my life. So all we did is we launched over here at this boat ramp right here, and I just turned and ran up the lake, and I just tried to find a creek. I wanted to find a creek that was kind of next to the main lake, but actually had some little creek arms back in here. And I wanted to see where the fish were within this creek. So what I did is I started out by driving out here in the middle of the lake, out here in 20 to 30 feet of water with my electronics. The number one thing I was looking for, more than anything, is I wanted to figure out if a thermocline had still set up on this lake. So a thermocline, again, is basically the area where you have that high oxygen and low oxygen water mixing. So I was just graphing. Here's just an example of a thermocline that I'm going to pull up on the screen here for you guys. Let me see here. Let me get this. Here we go. Okay, got this thermocline set up. Basically what I did is I just graphed out in the middle, cranked up my sensitivity on my fish finder, and if you crank up your sensitivity on your down imaging or 2D sonar, boom, there's your thermocline. So I looked for the thermocline on my fish finder, and I could see a little bit of a thermocline, but it wasn't very solid. It was kind of broken up, and kind of like the water was kind of not looking this like, this perfect, where it's like, obviously this fuzzy water down here, this is your thermocline. The clear dark water, that's your above the thermocline. So you can see it's very different looking. Didn't look quite like this. It was kind of blurry on the screen. It was kind of like just all mixed together. So I knew that the thermocline wasn't really set in that strong. Therefore, what I decided to do was start looking for some fish more towards the mouth of these creeks. And whenever I'm graphing, guys, I basically just get on the graph and I just start driving around obvious pieces of structure. Right here we have a main lake point. Here's another main lake point, another main lake point, another main lake point. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points through here. And I graphed all these points, and I found that this point right here had a little creek channel by it. There's a creek channel out here, and there was some brush piles that were set up on the tip of this point. The first day I was there over in North Carolina, I found that this point right here is where the fish were at. This was like the first week of September, and caught some really good fish, some 3 and 4 pounders out of these brush piles in a football jig. I was like, okay, awesome. Caught some fish here. We know what we're doing. Well, I came back like 4 or 5 days later. I fished a few of these other lakes around Raleigh in the meantime, and I came back like 4 or 5 days later. And we came back out for another on the water fishing lesson. I don't do those, by the way, anymore, guys. I apologize. Don't have time for them anymore, but I used to do them. But basically, I went out with another guy. We started and we graphed right over these brush piles to see if the fish were there, and they were gone. No fish in these brush piles. They had completely disappeared. And the bait fish that were sitting out here initially when I first got there 5 days ago, they were gone. There weren't any bait fish in front of this point in this creek channel. 4 or 5 days before that, there were bait fish here. So I'm like, okay, where could these bait fish have gone? Well, what happened is that these bait fish in the 4 or 5 days that we were there had moved about 100 yards further back into this creek. And this was only over a 4 or 5 day period, but we had some pretty cool weather those weeks. It was pretty cold, and the water temperature was dropping pretty fast. So what happened is that those bait fish made a move all the way back to right in here, this part of this creek now. And what the fish are basically doing is they're following these creek channels, and they're stopping off on places where, like Randy talked about, where there's nice pieces of cover or underwater structure. Here, there are a bunch of brush piles off this point. on these points, this point right here and this point right here, there were nice rock piles. There was a rock vein right here and a rock pile right here. And those shad had moved down this creek and were setting up right here in the middle of this creek channel here. Therefore, the bass followed the shad and they set up around these areas where there was cover, this rocky ridge, this rock pile. 4 or 5 days earlier, they were here. Now they're here. We then regraphed this creek, found that the fish were setting up in this section of the creek around these rock piles, and we caught several fish, 4 or 5 fish between 2.5 to 4 pounds right here. No fish out of this brush pile. It was completely empty, no fish there. Came back a week later. So I was there for 2 full weeks, so I got a really nice sense of these fish moving. A week later, water temperatures had dropped again, and they continued to fall, and those bait fish had now moved off of this area a little bit further in this creek onto this point right here. And over the course of 2 weeks, the fish had moved from this brush pile to this rock pile because those shad had moved. It's not like you can pull up in the fall, guys, and fish the same spot for 3-4 weeks and catch them. It's very, very rare. Usually these fish are moving a lot more. You have to adapt and fish the moment, fish the moment to find those fish. Basically, these fish had moved with the shad, and then they set up right here, and there was another little rock pile right there. These spots, we fished this brush pile. We fished these rock piles just because I wanted to make sure there was nothing there. No bites here, no bites here, no bites on this brush pile. All the bites we got were here. We caught 7 fish off of this rock pile. They went between 1.5 pounds and 3 pounds. So those fish had moved over the course of 2 weeks from the main part of the lake to the middle of this creek over the course of that time. And I was able to follow them because you could see those shad moving on the electronics. Follow them. That's what continuously happens. So if I was going to get to this lake again, let's say I went out there tomorrow and I had to figure out where are the fish in this creek. Well, what I would do is I would start out here on the main lake, just like I did when I first got there, see if the thermocline is set up. If it is, maybe these fish could be even way out here in 25 foot of water on this channel edge, or way out off the tip of some of these deeper points. Or if they're not there and there's no thermocline, I would start by graphing these main points here. I would then graph these secondary points, graph these points back in here until I found the bait fish and I found some cover and then found the fish. So it's more of you have to hunt the fish out. You have to find them. It's kind of like, Randy, when you think about deer and deer migration, if you're a hunter. I don't hunt, so I don't know enough about that. But I'm assuming that the deer don't just set up in the exact same spot day after day after day for the entire fall. I don't know about that for sure, but I know that it's kind of like nomadic tribes back in the day. Let's say if you're humans, I can think about that, where let's say you got these tribes that are following herds of buffalo or whatever it is. Those buffalo are going to be constantly moving, and you wouldn't expect to find that same tribe of people in the exact same spot for 3 months. They're going to move with the food, with the forage, and that's what those bass are doing. They're moving with the forage, and you can't just get caught up on, I caught them here 3 years ago on this point in September, so they're going to be there. The water conditions could be different. The water temperature could be different. All these things can be different. You have to find where those fish are on that day. And that's why I love fall fishing, because for me, I don't have to worry about practice or anything like that. I just go out there and figure it out day of, and that's what I'm the best at. Anyways, I don't like knowing where the fish are before I go, and these fish are a little bit more evasive, they're a little bit harder to find, but once you find them, they're absolutely stacked up in these spots, and you can catch tons of fish. So the reward is worth it once you find them. I guess that's the whole thing right there.
Yeah, definitely. There are a couple questions here I want to address here real quick. First of all, Bill, thanks for signing up. You're our first Bass Camp member. Much appreciated.
There we go.
Russ asked a good question. He's talking about once these bass move back into the creeks, do they move back and forth, and how long do they stay? Russ, in my opinion, that's all about water temperature. It's I think that once those bass move back into those creeks, as long as they have the available cover to stay in there and the bait fish, they stay in there until those water temperatures start to get down to the mid 50s. And the thing that I've noticed is once that water temperature starts hitting the mid 50s, where it's the mid 50s in the afternoon, not right off the bat in the morning, that's when those bass will start moving out of the back of those creeks. But to me, as long as you have the cover in there, it seems like they're pretty committed to it until that water temperature drops. And Bill asked a question as far as the effect that when does the perch bluegill spawn stop, and are the bass that key on the perch and the bluegill spawn affected by the blueback herring shad? Now, that's a good question. That's part of the fall migration, from what I've seen, in my opinion, is that you will have right now. There's a big bluegill spawn on most of the lakes around the country. As long as your water temperature is over 75 degrees, they spawn through the month of September, and that puts those fish extremely shallow. I'm talking about, you can't believe how shallow these fish will get if you have spawning bluegills in there. I mean, they'll get up in 12 inches of gin clear water chasing those bluegills. So that's one variable that you sort of have to take into consideration when you're trying to formalize and think about the fall transition. Is that's one of my favorite techniques and patterns in early fall is running the bluegill spawn. And one of my favorite ways to catch them, guys, is you take a like a Zoom horny toad, and you just, or the Zoom frog, which is a little bit louder, or a ribbit frog or something like that, and just cover water on those splatter banks and the back ends of the creeks and the coves where those bluegill spawn. That's a great way to catch quality bass in the early fall. And those bluegill like to spawn around flat banks that have some type of shade, overhanging trees, some type of cover like that. So that's a real good deal. Now, as far as the blueback herring go on there, as far as the effect that those have on there, you can have both. I mean, you can take a lake like Lake Hartwell. You may have some bass keying on the bluegill spawn, up in the river portions, but down the lake, that's not so much of a factor. They're going to be really focused and keyed on those blueback herring. That's a completely different topic. We could have a podcast just on blueback herring fall transition, because when you're talking about a true blueback herring lake and the fall fishing on there, that's unlike any other type of fishing that you're going to have. So that's a topic we'll save for later on there.
For sure. And there's a bunch of questions on other forage. We talked about shad. As you guys can tell, there's like an unlimited amount of knowledge and information that we could share on all this stuff, and there's so much that I wish we could share. It's just hard because like we've been talking for an hour and 5 minutes, Randy, and I feel like we barely are scratching the surface of this topic. That's how complicated it is. So we're gonna keep talking about this, guys. We're gonna probably just keep rehashing this. A couple just highlights, just some questions. One, there was a question about how crawfish play into this. I'll let you handle that, Randy, here in a second, but just high level for me. Crawfish don't play that big of a role offshore. If the crawfish are there, the bass will feed on them if the shad are also around. But I don't really focus on the crawfish bites offshore that much. It's much more of a player up shallow, and I'll let Randy cover that in a second. But the other question is how the bluegill and the perch migration work if your lake doesn't have any shad. So I'm just going to pull up a lake here really quick that might kind of fit this bill. This is Lake Mendota up in Wisconsin. This is kind of a good example of a natural lake that you might find in New York, Pennsylvania, Maine, Minnesota, places like that. It's just a big bowl that was carved out by a glacier, basically. And what you'll find is that unlike on the shad lakes, where you're going to have most of the fish out on the main part of the lake during the summer, most of your bass on these natural lakes are going to be on these flats right here. And this is a very dramatic example where you have this big flat and then it drops off into this abyss of 50 foot of water. And so this is a kind of an extreme example, but it can apply to other lakes too. And we don't have a ton of northern lake guys, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But basically, what happens is a lot of your bass are going to be set up on these flats, largemouth and smallmouth, during the middle of the summer. But as the summer progresses into the fall and the water temperatures start to drop, the reason the bass were up here on these flats during the summer is because the perch and the bluegill were spawning on these flats. Because perch and bluegill are the main forage for those bass are going to set up on those flats. But as the fall progresses, that perch and bluegill spawn is over, and the perch and bluegill move off of these flats out into the middle of nowhere out here. And that's where a lot of your bass are going to be set up. Now, not all the bluegill and perch will leave. There are still some bluegill and perch up here in real shallow water in the middle of the lake, but a good percentage, a pretty big percentage of those perch and bluegill will move off of the flats onto the middle of these super deep areas over like 50 foot of water. And what a lot of these smallmouth and largemouth will do is just randomly chase the bluegill and perch kind of up and down these break lines in deeper water, in anywhere from like 10 down to 50 foot of water, right where that first major break line is off the flat. And those perch will just basically roam out here and then move up and feed on the edge of the flat on grass and stuff and weeds and stuff like that, and then pull back out here in the middle of nowhere and just kind of hang out. And if you ever hear Mark Zona talk about northern fishing on any of there's a ton of like Michigan Outdoors and stuff like that, like small clips. If you listen to what he's talking about, he always says in the fall, the best place to go catch giant largemouth and smallmouth is in 25 to 40 foot of water on a little swim bait on the edge of these flats, way off in deep water. He says not very many guys do it, but that's where a lot of your biggest bags are going to come in the fall. You can catch fish in that 8 to 12 foot of water still, kind of like on the outside edge of the grass, kind of right inside of it, and you can catch them up in super shallow water, but a lot of those fish are going to be way out here off the flat. Sets up very different on those northern lakes, Randy. And I grew up in Wisconsin, so I'm pretty familiar with all that works because that's where I learned to fish. But unfortunately, we can't fish on those northern lakes because we're here in Arkansas, Missouri, so we don't have that many viewers from up there. But hopefully, for those guys who are watching, that made sense.
Yeah, you guys that live up in New York, man, you guys got some great fishing up there. I'm getting a little burned out on seeing all these dudes holding up 4 and 5 pound smallmouth over the last month on all the different tournament circuits out there. I just makes me want to get up there to Lake St. Clair. But back to the crawdad question, let's address that a little bit. I don't think that you can overthink, or I don't want to say it's good, but I don't think that you can really put too much thought into crawdads when it comes to bass. I think that, bass are super opportunistic, and I don't think that they key on one specific type of prey at any one time. And the reason I say that is I literally cannot count of how many times that I've caught bass busting shad, like surface on the surface, busting shad, eating shad, and I catch the fish and there's a crawdad pincher sticking out of its throat that the bass is in 30 foot of water busting shad. I've caught fish on drop shots over 75 foot of water in suspended timber with crawdads sticking out of their throat. I think that, in my opinion, when it comes to crawdads, I think a lot of the bass feed on crawdads at night. I think that's the primary time they go for crawdads. I think that's probably when they're more active. And I don't spend much time emphasis on crawdad colors as far as matching the hatch to it. Believe me, I've experimented. I have got every color of jig skirt that you can imagine, and I have tried to match and mimic crawfish exactly to the ones I'm fishing for in the lake I'm at. It just doesn't work for me. I think that it's situational. They're, like I said, opportunistic. They're going to take advantage of it when they can. And in my opinion, in bass fishing, I just don't think you can put too much confidence or too much thought into that.
For sure. I find with the fall, I know that there's not a lot of research on crawfish because I've talked to Rick Clun about this, and he basically said that the reason he feels like there's not a lot of research on crawfish is because there's not a big market to sell the crawfish. I feel like there's a lot more like biological study research on like shad migration, stuff like that. So you can find documentation on shad migration, stuff like that I've read, and that's where I get a lot of my stuff I talk about. It's like from studies from biologists and stuff. But crawfish, there's not really as much information out there as related to like freshwater fisheries and stuff like that. So it's kind of tricky to know what the crawfish are doing. In general, you'll find that the crawfish become very active up in shallow water in the fall when water temperatures are between like 75 and 50 degrees, like falling from 75 down to 50. Those crawfish will come out of the rocks and they'll be on the main lake, back of the creeks, all kinds of places from what I've seen. And honestly, what I find is that the bass will feed on the crawfish if the bass are in that area, like Randy said. But I don't find that the bass migration is tied to crawfish very much, or at least from what I've seen. I can't find out if there are crawfish down in an area other than by catching a fish and seeing one in their throat. So it's also very tricky for me to track them. The way I've understood bass migration in the fall myself is by using my electronics to follow the bait fish and then make inferences and guesses on what the bass are doing based on the bait fish location. The only way I know the bait fish are there is because I can use the electronics. I can't use electronics to see if the crawfish are there, so I can't come up with a really good theory on that. Maybe I need to be doing some scuba diving or something. Maybe we can figure that out in the future. That would be a whole big project, though. So if someone wants to do that or put some investment dollars up to hire a scuba diver for me to go scuba dive Table Rock Lake one day or one day a month in the fall, hey, I'm down for it. I'll do the research. But for now, we're just going to have to stick to the shad.
Yeah, one question there. We had a question about Florida fishing. There's no creeks as far as the migration goes. In my opinion, from Florida, I fished in Florida a lot during the fall time of the year, and it's all about identifying the main lake vegetation because the bass are using different vegetation in Florida different times of the year. Sometimes they're in the offshore hydrilla, sometimes they're in the pads, sometimes they're in the dollar grass, sometimes they're in the Kissimmee grass. So a Florida bass is completely different than a man-made impoundment. They use the same type of areas most of the year. They just set up in different type of grasses depending upon the stage of the grass, usually on the main lake, because most Florida lakes are just like bowls except for a few canals here and there. And the only time I've done any good in canals has been when the fish are bedding.
Yeah, I've never fished in Florida, so I have no insight on that one. So I'm just gonna trust Randy on that. Florida fishing seems very difficult. I don't feel like I would like it very much. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of rhyme or reason to what goes on there. A couple other questions here. One comment here. Number one question: if the bass aren't biting, will Bridgeford beef jerky temporarily ease the pain a little? JD, yes. Bridgeford beef jerky always eases the pain. I've been loving my Bridgeford beef jerky, actually, Randy. Just a little side note. I've been doing a lot of CrossFit workouts, and I got a nutritionist to kind of make sure that I'm like eating right because I was getting my energy to dip really low. And so, one thing I need is a lot of protein. And the great thing about Bridgeford beef jerky, especially when you're on the lake, is it's a great source of protein. It's really hard to scarf down chicken breast that's cold in the boat. So Bridgeford beef jerky, one package has 33 grams of protein. So for those who like to work out and need protein, it's a great source of protein. I mean, I probably eat too much Bridgeford beef jerky. I need to watch my sodium intake a tiny bit. But other than that, it's a great on-the-lake snack. Okay, tangent over. So another question here is, Steven, any hints on how to narrow down water on Lake Cumberland when the bass or when the shad are everywhere? That's a great question. Kind of similar like what you do with here on Table Rock. I'll just have Table Rock pulled up here. Lake Cumberland is similar. It's just giant and massive lake. What I find on lakes where there's shad everywhere, and I've seen this happen on lakes like Table Rock and stuff like that, 2 tips I can give to you. 1, find the biggest shad you can find. A lot of these creeks, you're going to find that there's going to be, even right now, balls of little tiny shad. They're like 1 inch or 2 inches long. And those are not the shad that I'm looking for, especially when I'm fishing offshore. This is a little sneaky tidbit here. I'm looking for the biggest possible shad. And I use my electronics. I can actually differentiate the size of the shad with my electronics. That's something we talk about in the bass camp. We won't share that one on the live stream. There's some stuff we got to hold back for the paying customers, because otherwise we just give everything away. But I identify the size of the shad with my electronics. And then by doing that, I can determine where potentially bigger fish are going to be, and that's usually where you'll find the bigger fish. The other thing that I do, guys, is I try to find areas where it's not just absolutely covered up in shad. When you go back in these creeks, you'll find that most of the shad, let's say, are going to migrate. They migrate into this zone, and maybe this zone of this creek is just absolutely hammered with shad. And there might be more shad up here, more shad over here. What I like to do is in the fall, because these fish are going from the main lake here back into this creek, if I find that this part of this lake is just covered with shad, there's absolutely everywhere, it's just like a wall. It looks like a football field worth of shad. I will move a little bit further back into the creeks and get a little bit ahead of those bass, because usually there's not quite as many shad. And if there's so many shad in the creek that it's just like a wall of shad, those bass aren't going to be able to differentiate your bait from the actual living bait fish, and it's very tough to get those fish to bite. So I don't actually like to fish in areas that are absolutely loaded in shad. I like to kind of stay just a tiny bit ahead of them in areas where there's maybe just balls of shad every 50 yards, 40 yards, something like that. So they're not everywhere, because that way those bass can actually differentiate my bait from the real bait fish. So I just stay a little bit ahead of those shad in like this area. And usually those bass will stay a little bit ahead of them as well, especially some of the bigger fish. So that's just a little trick that potentially can help. So awesome. Cool. how's the Randy? Here's a question for you from Bill. How's the fall and winter soft stick bait bite? That is a great question. I don't throw a fluke or a stick bait or like a Cinco, anything like that in the fall. Any thoughts on that, Randy?
The only time I've really done much on that, Bill, is like if you got a lake that has a lot of pier type docks, like not the floating docks, but the pier docks. I've done really good in the fall time of the year on like just a soft stick bait with like an 1/8 ounce sinker, pitching and flipping it around the pilings. But I don't. That's one of the few times that I don't use a soft stick bait a lot. Sometimes I will wacky rig it around floating docks if those fish are suspended up under the floats. But the best I've done by far is pitching it around docks that have pilings on it.
Good deal. Awesome. Yeah, and that's one thing Gabe's saying is he likes to throw a jig in the fall to avoid competition with all the shad. That's a great comment there, Gabe. And yeah, football jig is a great bait. Again, football jigs are best in football season. So if you guys want to get offshore bait or even a shallow water bait in the fall, football jigs are one of the best fall baits, period, in the fall. Anytime it's football season, throw a football jig. That's the rule of thumb. One other thing too on those shad, if you do find yourself around a lot of shad, but you think you can catch fish, go to really big baits, like the 6.5-inch floater spoon. It's a really big spoon. It will differentiate itself from the other bait fish just because it is a big profile. That can also help. But yeah, that's kind of some tips on baits. So Randy, that is pretty much the deal right there. A lot of information. I feel like we left people with maybe more questions than they had when they got here, but hopefully that was a good starter for you guys, kind of a decent overview, if anything, of how the fall migration works.
Yeah, guys, don't feel, like I said, I want to leave you with this. Do not feel like you're somehow less of an angler or you're frustrated if you're having a tough time this time of year or over for the next month, because we all do. Jonny does, I do, all the pros do. It's a super tough time of year. And like I said, just be patient with it and, just fish your strength. What you like to do. There's usually going to be something going on that everybody likes to do. It's probably the toughest time of year to catch quality bass right now as far as any other time of the year.
For sure. You got to fish the moment. That's the name of the channel, guys, but you got to move and stick with those fish because they're constantly moving and changing their position. They're not just going to stay in one spot, which is what makes it tough to catch them. Couple things real quick, guys. One, we really appreciate if you would leave a like down in this video. It's one of the best ways to support the channel. Just leave a like down below. Also subscribe if you want to see more of our live streams. We live stream every single week. Actually, next week, guys, we're going to be doing an on the water live stream. So we're going to be out in the boat. I'll be out in the boat showing you how I find fish on another lake. We're going to do the same thing we did a couple weeks ago where I'm just on the lake live with the camera and I'm just going to go find some fish and hopefully catch something. So definitely stay tuned for that. I know you guys like that on the water stuff live. And I'm going to go to the lake again I haven't been to in like months. So hopefully there's cell reception. We're just going to kind of go with it and go on the fly. And if not, we'll just do another live stream some other time. Another thing, too, if you guys want to sign up for a Bridgeford Beef Jerky giveaway to win a case of beef jerky, just put a comment of what your number one most asked question is, or what is the question you want the answered the most about fall bass migration. Leave that comment in the actual comment section of this video, and we will enter you in for a Bridgeford Beef Jerky giveaway. Sorry, I've talked too much today, Randy. I'm already kind of like losing it. But huge shout out to Bridgeford for sponsoring the podcast and doing our Bridgeford Beef Jerky giveaway. Mr. Cha, if you were here, you won last week's giveaway, so just send us an email over at info@fishthemoment.com. Again, huge shout out to the Bass Tank for sponsoring the Fish the Moment podcast, our second sponsor. Finally, if you guys are interested in getting more detailed information about shallow and offshore fishing and want information that maybe is presented a little bit more structured approach with a really detailed curriculum and everything like that, rather than just like this live format where we just kind of go off the cuff, definitely go to our website, fishthemoment.com, then head to the Bass Camp tab. This is new, and you can actually go to the Fish the Moment Bass Camp. We're going to be doing a shallow and offshore camp where Randy's going to talk to you guys for 4 hours about how to become a better shallow water angler. I'll talk to you for 4 hours about how to become a better offshore angler. We're going to build a curriculum where we're going to be kind of talking about both topics in parallel. So you're going to get similar frameworks of how we teach the information, but very different information within it. So you can kind of figure out which technique is best for you. You can also meet us because it's in person. And this is going to be in Springfield, Missouri on October 2nd. So have about 3 weeks to sign up. Saturday, October 2nd. It's from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. at the Boatworks in Springfield, Missouri. So definitely check that out. You can sign up here. Only 30 spots available. The camp is going to be $500. Actually, 29 spots available. Someone already signed up. That was Bill. So definitely sign up for that bass camp if you guys want to meet us, and also do some in-person instruction on offshore and shallow fishing. So that is that, Randy. I think that we had a pretty good stream tonight, and thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everybody. You had a pretty good crowd tonight, and it's a topic worth discussing because we're right in the middle of it over the next month or so. And like I said, hope to see you guys at the bass camp. It's if you guys like what we're doing here at Fish the Moment, it's a really great way to support Fish the Moment, and it's we got a bunch of secrets we'll share with you guys too.
For sure. It's going to be a really, really good deal. If you guys, again, like the channel, subscribe. We're going to be doing more podcasts like this with me and Randy, live streams, giving up the juice. And next week, next Tuesday, we're going to be doing the On the Water live stream. So definitely check that out. It's going to be a good deal on the lake, hopefully catching some big fish and hopefully not struggling. I can show you how to actually find fish in the fall, hopefully, on lakes I have not been to in a long time. So it's going to be a kind of a going out there blind, trying to find fish and showing you how we do it. So anyways, guys, thanks for checking out the live stream. Shout out again to our sponsors, Bridgeford and the Bass Tank. And other than that, we'll see you guys next Tuesday for another live stream. Thanks again, and have a great night.